The Jundland wastes are not to be travelled lightly.
Welcome to Virtue in the Wasteland, a podcast about culture, civil courage, and issues that matter. Come along as your hosts, Dr. Jeff Mallinson and Dr. Daniel Van Voorhis, lead our expedition through our complex cultural landscape in search of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Welcome to the first video-recorded edition of Virtue in the Wasteland. 107 episodes in, and here we are, finally being videotaped, and it's only appropriate that for our first episode being videotaped, being put on the internet, we have not only one of our favorite guests, who has done two of our shows that were downloaded quite a number of times, but also the founding director of the League of Faithful Masks. The League of Faithful Masks, of course, is what has sponsored this podcast. We have with us Dr. Uwe Siemon-Netto. Uwe, how you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Well,
I mean, given my age, it's all right, you know.
We are here to talk about a number of things. The first thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about the second edition of your book.
Third.
The third edition of your book.
You're just holding the second.
I'm just holding the second. The third edition of your book, Triumph of the Absurd. Now, if someone hasn't gone and purchased the book, they can purchase it through Amazon. They can go to 1517legacy.com, as this is now being published by 1517 Legacy Press, I suppose. But they can also go back to an earlier show where you discussed not only the role of the vocation of the person doing journalism, but also with your time in Vietnam. As you mentioned to me earlier, 40 years ago, Saigon fell. 50 years ago, this April, we had the first American ground troops fighting the North Vietnamese. Right. And you were there covering the very first battle between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. Now, we're going to be talking about your book, Triumph of the Absurd, and the subtitle, A Reporter's Love for the Abandoned People of Vietnam. We're going to get into some more contemporary issues later, but for those that haven't not read the book, for those that haven't heard the podcast, can we get just a little version, just a little bit, a little taste of what your book, Triumph of the Absurd, is all about?
Yes. I will read you the first couple of paragraphs of my preface in the book because that also leads to the current debacle of Middle Eastern affairs.
And we're going to be talking about ISIS.
ISIS and all that sort of thing. But it's linked, you see.
Yeah.
What I observed, I was a West German television correspondent, newspaper correspondent there. And in a sense, I didn't have a dog in that fight because I was German. I wasn't an American or Vietnamese. But of course, I became very involved because I experienced and saw what was going on there and what was very badly and underreported here in the United States. Not so much by the war reporters; they were by and large very good, but by the media stars.
The media stars, the Walter Cronkites.
Well, Walter Cronkite was just about the worst example of what one can do. And let me read from first these two paragraphs, then you will see where I'm heading.
Sure.
40 years ago, absurdity triumphed in South Vietnam. On April the 30th, 1975, the wrong side conquered this tortured country. The communists did not achieve their victory because they owned the moral high ground, as their adulators in the Western world would have us believe. They crushed South Vietnam with torture, mass murder, and other horrendous acts of terror committed with cold strategic intent in violation of international law. I lived in Paris when their tanks crushed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. As I watched this on television, I wondered, how did they manage to gain the upper hand after their clear military defeat I had witnessed as a combat correspondent during the Tet Offensive in Hue in 1968. The cover of this book shows me after 2 weeks of heavy combat during Tet in Hue. The answer can be found in the sinister prediction by General Vo Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese defense minister, and I quote, "The enemy, meaning the West, does not possess the psychological and political means to fight a long drawn-out war," unquote. In his commentary on the fall of Saigon, Adalbert Weinstein, the brilliant military specialist of Germany's renowned Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, summed up the reason for the victory of this totalitarian power in one short, elegiac sentence: America could not wait. And now it goes on. Giap's prophetic words and the adjective absurd will reappear time and again in several chapters in this book. They are meant to be a recurrent theme intended to remind my readers why I wrote this memoir of my 5 years in Vietnam 4 decades ago. So I would like this to be the leitmotif. What we have here, what I've experienced, is in 1968 a clear victory of the United States military and the South Vietnamese military. Let's forget those; they were good, and the South Koreans and the Australians and New Zealanders, Thais and others. Clear victory over the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, who had broken a ceasefire agreement over Tet, which is the Lunar New Year, and had attacked 100 cities, including Saigon and Hue, the old imperial capital. I was actually in Laos just before that, because I'd been told there wouldn't be anything going on because there would be a ceasefire, which the Allies...
For the holiday. Everyone had agreed.
I will tell you who tipped me off that something very severe was going on. A retired and very luscious Laotian opium courier.
That's our favorite story.
It's my favorite part of the book.
Okay.
We can't restate the whole thing, but it's so wonderful.
I will not go into salacious detail.
You've got to read the book.
You've got to read the book. It's going to be it's one of the better.
Uwe, I was in love. I was in love with this young woman.
She was great. You read it. Yeah, I call her Mai. Actually, she had another name.
So she's a retired opium courier.
She was a retired opium courier and multimillionaire whose villa was tiled with solid gold tiles. The entire villa, the whole ground floor, all gold. She, who linked me up with a very senior French spook, military spook, and who said, "What the hell are you doing here in Laos? You should be in Vietnam." I said, "The Americans, the South Vietnamese, they all tell me nothing's going to happen." He said, "You better get your fanny over to Vietnam." And actually arranged for me to get a seat. Somebody had to be bounced off the airplane so I could get back into Saigon from Vientiane via Bangkok. And so I was actually there when the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy. I was standing right across the boulevard and witnessed this, like a traffic accident. Except here they were charging the American embassy. And then I was up in Hue and in house-to-house combat, and of course I stood at the rim of a mass grave which was filled with about 1,000 bodies, mainly of women and children and old men, and some of them burned to death, some of them clobbered to death, some of them shot to death, some of them buried alive. You could see that the grave was found because the fingernails or the hands of these beautiful women had come out of the ground, trying to claw their way into into freedom, of course, then they died.
This is
and these things, and I'll jump ahead here because this is a point that is so instrumental in the understanding of what went on here. I was standing there with a guy called Peter Braystrup. He was the Washington Post bureau chief in Saigon, a friend of mine. And we were flummoxed and shocked, and having both been in heavy combat, and I think suffering from heavy PTSD, because we were very close to death. We stood there and watched this, and we had witnessed the American and South Vietnamese victory over the communists at huge expense, cost of blood, their own blood, American blood and South Vietnamese. Nonetheless, they killed more than half of the invading North Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese were finished militarily. There was nothing going on. So there was an American television team traipsing around this grave aimlessly. And Peter, who's dead unfortunately now, but Peter asked them, tell me, why are you not filming this scene here? And the cameraman said, we're not here to spread anti-communist propaganda back home in America. These were American journalists. Okay. Now, from our perspective, it was very, very clear that the war was, to all intents and purposes, over. The Americans had won. The South Vietnamese had won. The communists had turned the population, the public opinion in Hue, which used to be very xenophobic, totally against them because of all these horrible massacres they committed, kangaroo trials, mass executions, and horrible stuff. And then Walter Cronkite flew in later, and without having witnessed this, opined before 20 million viewers that this war was unwinnable and had to be one had to enter. And that was the end of that. And then LBJ, President Johnson, is supposed to have said, I have lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And that, of course, led to Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. And
Nixon comes in,
and then the end came in, and then they engaged in negotiations, which I also covered in Paris peace talks, and agreed on, I think, a bogus deal, a phony deal, but nonetheless, but promised if the North Vietnamese broke that contract, that deal, that treaty, that the Americans would come in. And then Congress refused to supply the South Vietnamese army. The Americans had left by the time with weapons, even though Nixon had promised to get involved again, send the Air Force, do everything.
To reinforce the
troops. So 80,000 North Vietnamese flooded across the North-South Vietnamese border, breaking the thing. Congress decided it's not going to happen. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. More than 150,000 people were actually executed within days of the first of the North Vietnamese victory.
No, I want to interject here, because when I read this in the first edition, there are horrors upon horrors, tragedy upon tragedy. But the thing that haunts me still, the thing that I found most haunting, is that image of the beautiful fingernails coming up out of the ground. Yeah. But that itself, we see this. We see whether it's Uganda or Liberia. I mean, there's horrors upon horrors. What to me was the most terrifying was the way in which the news media, the journalism, or you might say pseudo-journalism, led to a retreat or a loss after not only a clear sense that there was a potential for victory, but also that one line that we are not going to have anti-communist propaganda. Sure, yeah. But the reason we really wanted to tie this into our current state of affairs with radical Islam in Europe and in the Near East, Middle East, is that we ought to be worried, I would think, that this very same phenomenon could be the undermining of our efforts against radical Islam.
And Jeff and Uwe, one of the things that I found in this, it's filled with haunting stories and the deaths and the tens, hundreds of thousands of deaths of South Vietnamese, of American and other soldiers. It's not simply a recounting of what happened. It's not simply a condemning of Lyndon Baines Johnson or a condemnation of Cronkite, although it certainly is, but it's a condemnation of the entire thing using a very specific word, absurd. Yeah. And you said that's one of the sort of leitmotifs, the idea of the absurd. And when I think of the absurd, instantly I go to early 20th century in the arts. Yeah. I go to the sort of French etymology of absurd, meaning not to be listened to, of something that is just beyond ridiculous, beyond even, you can't even, it's not even stupid or wrong, it's absurd.
Well, the absurdity, I mean, and you'll see throughout this book, I mean, I use the term absurd in many different ways. I compared the whole thing to the theater of the absurd, UNESCO, and that sort of thing. But what is so absurd about this whole thing is, and what is so absurd about now, what's going on now, that because America didn't have, as Weinstein, this German military writer, said, who was a brigadier general in the West German army, by the way, America didn't have the patience, so they allowed themselves to be hoodwinked. They made every concession, and it's the same thing all over now. I mean, we are now having children being crucified in Iraq and in Syria. We have people being burned to death.
21 beheadings.
We have 21 beheadings. It's just one show, but I mean, it's going on day after day after day in areas that had been won by the American armed forces, and then the Americans pull out. Suddenly they lose patience, and that is so. And you see, Osama bin Laden had read Giap. We know that he had used the same quote that Giap, the North Vietnamese,
he knew that the Americans didn't have the
patience. The enemy is not psychologically and politically not equipped to do this. You have immediately this cliche, let's bring the boys home by Christmas. There's all that sort of thing. And then came, now fortunately this is not the case at the moment, what I found particularly disturbing about the Vietnam War was the way the American military, the American soldiers were treated at the home front. I actually worked as a chaplain intern in a VA, and when I studied theology, in a VA in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Horrendous stories. Everyone, I had 3 therapy groups, which I ran jointly with a shrink, of Vietnam veterans, about 30 guys each. Each and every one of them had been called a baby killer within 24 hours of returning from Vietnam.
I have a very good friend who is a Vietnam veteran. Yeah. And we discussed, he's been a subject of a book, and we discussed a number of ways in which the idea of the veteran, for him, from the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, all the way to the present, until maybe this newest round of soldiers have come home, that for decades he lived with this idea of the Vietnam vet as the bad guy,
the underdog,
as the damaged,
baby killer.
as the exactly, and that this actually haunted him not just when he got back,
to this day,
but kept.
Then to this day, there are veterans living behind concertina wires in the boonies somewhere in the woods of Minnesota and God knows where, because they could not reintegrate. So now you can't say that this is the case. Now at least the veterans are being treated decently. They're being treated decently, but again their sacrifice has been in vain because they won the bloody war. They won it as they in Iraq, as the American armed forces and the South Vietnamese and the Koreans won in Vietnam. Now, one thing I have to correct you on, and that is in defense of my American colleagues, you have to distinguish very, very clearly between the grunt, the good old-fashioned combat reporter. Cronkite used to be one of those, but that wasn't World War II.
Actually embedded.
Well, not embedded. Embedded was something else. No, we could. We weren't embedded. Embedded meant that you were embedded with a unit. I could join any unit anytime. I could hop from unit to unit, and it was. That is another story.
So Cronkite was doing all right in the early days, but he
in World War II.
Yeah, that's what you're saying. So, but then he had kind of become a celebrity and maybe abandoned.
Left-wing.
Yeah.
I mean,
so he let his ideology guide.
Yeah, which is not now. That said, I would say the majority of the the correspondents, the combat correspondents, were very decent fellows and did a very good job. But their copy wound up further back in the back of the book. Page 58, in the New York Times or something like that.
Well, this is the Yazidi children. The Yazidi are these like. For me, as a religion scholar, this very fascinating, small, lost or vanishing, religious group, and also culture. These children are getting killed. This becomes big news for about a week, and then we fatigue. Now we fatigue as viewers of the media or readers. To what extent, is it our fault that we don't have, as a culture, the kind of stamina to be able to focus on important subjects and move on? I don't know we can fix it, but certainly the way the thing's set up now, the way that journalists are paid, if they're paid at all, is going to be based on supply and demand. So we get what we want to hear or what we need to hear, and then when we get tired of it, it's not going to be interesting to us anymore because we've already heard about this happening, right? But it's still going on. It just kind of smooths over. Now you, in a magazine in Switzerland, Factum, you've got. I will probably try to find a way to link this on our webpage, virtueinthewasteland.com. But it's a pretty startling image of a man crucified. And could you tell me how did this play? With the publishers and with how does this work?
Let's double back here for a second.
Yeah.
Let's step back for a second. It's a big debate throughout the Western world, and especially here in the United States, over whether to show these images that ISIS have produced themselves of their own crimes, and the official line is, you see this on the O'Reilly show and elsewhere, well, we don't want to make this too appealing for demented wannabe candidates, recruits for this thing, which I think is baloney. It is because they don't want it to be, they're too squeamish about it. The thing is that unless, if, for example, after World War II, right after World War II, the world had not been shown the heaps of bones from Auschwitz and in other concentration camps, the myth of, or the idiocy of Holocaust deniers would have been generalized. I mean, everybody, no civilized nation.
The way in which we maybe look at Stalin or Pol Pot, it would have been not as personal and as visceral.
And now they don't want to see this. So the editor of this magazine, it's a small magazine, small German language magazine, which sells well in Germany, well, in a German-speaking country, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, but it's published in Switzerland. It's a Christian magazine. And I said, come on, let's break this idiotic taboo and show the people of Germany and of Europe, what it's like. And I lifted this picture, which is a crucified man in Raqqa. In Raqqa, I lifted this from a Polish newspaper website, which had the guts to publish an ISIS website. And then contrasted this with the Isenheim altarpiece in Colmar, the
Grunewald.
500 Grunewald, Matthias Grunewald.
Dan knows it well.
I do.
There it is. And I said, here it is. I mean, Grunewald had one advantage over us. He didn't have to fight against political correctness, which in my article I call the idol of today. And I said, actually, political correctness is the God beside the God who says you should not have any gods beside me.
The Grunewald altarpiece, going back just a second.
500 years.
Going back to it for a second. This will also be, we'll put it on the website, it is one of the most haunting pictures of the crucifix. It was painted for a hospital, for a children's ward in the hospital, so that others could see just how devastating and horrific the crucifixion was.
Yes.
And it was thought that through seeing this, there could develop a kind of understanding, a kind of empathy, and there wasn't the squeamishness necessarily. If you show that today, if you tried to put that in your local church, if you came up and said, "Here's my altarpiece," just about every church would say, "No, thank you.
No, thank you." Yeah.
Can we just get a cross?
At least for our Lutheran churches, a nice Jesus, nice
maybe Anglo-Saxon,
with the nice the lamb.
That's your
the
people
Jesus
that have
lamb.
blonde. We've got the brown hair, but the idea
Who's
being
the we? Dutch people.
Saying.
There's some blonde Dutch people,
and the idea that by looking at these things, by facing it, not only intellectually, but by facing it with our eyeballs, you're able to, and this is part of why I think this book is so haunting and such a great, terrible read in the sense that it just hurts your soul, is that it makes you confront the absurdity. It makes you confront it intellectually. It makes you confront it here in the book, in your sort of mind's eye. And we don't want to do that, right? We'd rather have a sort of picture of.
It's not nice.
It's not nice, and and maybe we should.
I mean, we know this from Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Ever since we are supposed to be nice, and it's not nice. But you have to say it. And of course, in Germany now, I have seen some reaction. Some woman in Germany saying, "Oh no, you didn't have to put this on the cover." Well, the cover is called Passion, meaning Lent, or cover, 2015. And I'm contrasting passion with passion. And of course, it's theologically also perfectly sound to do this. But no, don't upset me. Well, we know it's bad.
And she's talking about the Grunewald altar. No, she's talking about the crucifixion picture.
No, she's talking about our cover page.
Yeah.
Others, on the other hand, said, well, thank you very much you did it. And I must say, at least a few remaining Orthodox Lutherans that we have in Germany have responded very positively to that. But it has to be done. It has to be shown. And they also have to be confronted with what their squeamishness accomplishes. There's an in memoriam page preceding my book here. And it says, this book has been written in the memory of the countless innocent victims of the communist conquests of South Vietnam. The hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children massacred in villages, cities, especially Hue. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers and officials who were executed, tortured, or imprisoned after the end of the war. The millions who were driven from their country, and the hundreds of thousands who drowned in the process. Here, we are in Orange County. You have a whole city full of boat people. Westminster, Garden Grove, The brave Arvin soldiers who fought on when all was lost. I mean, they've been bad-mouthed by the American media as cowards. Now, no, they fought on until, even knowing it was lost, and there are valiant generals who took their own lives in the end. the young South and North Vietnamese conscripts who died in the so-called War of Liberation, which brought no liberty. The 58,272 American, 4,407 South Koreans, etc., soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice. And then being German, I said, my German compatriots who were murdered by the North Vietnamese colonists, especially doctors, good Christians who came out of their Christian conviction to minister to Vietnamese of any political persuasion, murdered, slaughtered, forced to dig their own graves, and then had to kneel in front of them, boom, massacre.
One of the things that we've done on a previous show is we've talked about sometimes the inanity of making Hitler comparisons or making comparisons.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to go here.
That it happens far too often.
Is it okay, Dan, to use
this
Vietnam?
Is where I'm going.
Yeah.
Exactly. That oftentimes we use, the argumentum ad Hitlerum, right? You just make the argument to Hitler, or you say, oh, it's like the Holocaust, and oftentimes that is highly offensive to what actually took place in World War II. But one of the reasons why we keep going back to it as an argument or as an archetype of evil is, as you mentioned, because we have the pictures. We've had to be confronted, right? Even in our textbooks, for some reason, even in our high school history textbooks, they still will show pictures of Auschwitz. They still have the movies,
Well, Dan, it's not only that they show the pictures, but it's almost as if we've established this, that you have to. In other words, to avert your gaze from this is to allow it to happen again.
There's a museum of tolerance, right?
So,
in Los Angeles
and it is almost mandatory that you get young people to have to pass through this so that we don't do it again. But we don't do it when it's not white people and Europeans. Right, to an extent,
exactly.
Right?
And
so when it's Vietnam, or if it's now Islamic terrorism or whatever else, I mean, we don't give that the same highlight.
Yeah, there are two things that are interesting. The parallels, and tell me to what extent maybe they work. Here we have a war that the hearts and minds have been won over of the people. The war is essentially won by the Americans and allies. Yet, because of the media, and because of a presidential cycle, an election cycle that is constantly upon us, and because of presidents who don't really have the nerve, or at least the congressmen who don't have the nerve, everything falls apart. And then it becomes a footnote, or Vietnam becomes the example of American folly in the world, and then we move on to the next part of the Cold War, or what have you.
You're absolutely
the same
right.
thing is happening right now with the media, with the Congress, with the lack of nerve, the hearts and minds being won, and what is going to become. And what we're seeing some of it, it's ISIS.
This is precisely the point, which makes me wonder if not in my day, and I'm 78, so I mean my life expectancy is not enormous anymore. Even if I should turn to 100, it would be only 22 more years. If in my day democracy would not collapse altogether, you will find, and this is, please, I mean, I'm living in this country, I'm happy, I love America, I love being here, I'm still a German citizen, but I love being here. But you will find, though, in my book, that the British had a totally different approach. And had they been followed, there's a chapter in this about it, had they followed the British advice by a guy called Sir Robert Thompson, who was one of the architects of the British victory in Malaya, in the Malayan uprising preceding the Vietnam War. And the British had patience, you see. And Thompson, whom I met and whom I discussed this with, kept saying, you have to be patient. You cannot do this slam-bang wallop. And he said, instead of coming up with idiotic statistics, like the body count, a ridiculous thing that McNamara and Westmoreland invented, he said it's totally irrelevant how many communists run around the jungle treading on snakes and God knows what. as long as you have a safe civilian population. So what his concept was clear and hold, clear an area, secure the civilian population, make sure they can live peaceably and successfully and well in this very rich country, rich agriculture and all that sort of thing. And that was superseded for strictly political reasons by search and destroy. So the Americans, these poor bastards of American soldiers, were sent into combat, and then when night fell, retreated. And there is one, if I may give you an example of how idiotic this was, when this prevailed over the British concept, because the British concept, it was a toss-up. Mm-hmm. And many American military commanders, especially special forces, concurred with the British. Here's what happened. One of my first operations I participated in South Vietnamese large unit was that when we were called into a village that had been attacked in central Vietnam, attacked at night. And we walked into this village maybe an hour or two after the Viet Cong had left. Too late. And there, dangling from the trees in the village square, were the mayor of the village, his wife, their 12 children, like the organ pipes. The mayor had his tongue cut out and his penis cut off and shoved into his bleeding mouth before he was strung up. His wife had her breasts cut off before she was executed. But even worse, they started executing in front of these, not executing, murdering, that's a bad use of word. The baby first, then like the organ pipes, slowly the parents and the whole village had to watch how the Viet Cong had tortured to death these children before they finally tortured to death the parents.
And this is going to do something to the people in, obviously this is going to do something to the people in the village, but just the image of seeing their leadership, the image that they're seeing is saying to them, we're not safe.
Well,
Precisely. And that's what the Viet Cong are doing.
Precisely. And I came in and I got a story from one of the village elders who spoke very good French, and who described this to me in greatest detail. And he said, where were the Americans? Where were the South Vietnamese? Well, mind you, the Americans had only at that point advisors there. You see, this was in early 1965, before the main forces arrived. But by that time, the supporters of the search and destroy rather than clear and hold version of anti-guerrilla warfare had prevailed. And Sir Robert Thompson left, and the British mission closed down. And he left, and Nixon later called him back, but by that time it was too late.
Yeah.
And now we are in the same predicament again.
With Islam, with radical Islam.
And here's one thing, and I got to finish this one point, and then you've got to go somewhere else. But when you watch American television programs, even the so-called conservatives will say, well, we don't want to occupy this land. We just want to go in, kill them all, and bomb them all. That's the same baloney again at what's happened in Vietnam. No, you have to provide security. It doesn't matter whether the security is American or if these are your friends, but the Americans know about how to do this, and they did it exceedingly well in Iraq until Obama pulled out the forces.
Well, this is part of American 20th century, you could say, from perhaps the Spanish-American War through World War II.
Yes.
The American way of fighting, and this has to do a lot with the context of the various wars from 1898 to 45, is very much a sort of come in.
We'll come in late, fix it, and get out.
And get out quick.
And that's what we hope.
And it worked for those times because of what that was. But to use that same mentality in Vietnam, to use that same mentality in Afghanistan.
Don't forget Korea.
Korea, absolutely.
I mean, we are under the threat of a North Korean nuke that might as well come here and
MacArthur.
Yeah, MacArthur. I mean, we are under the threat of that. Instead of carrying things to and find an easy way out. It's done. Now let's go to another show.
And technically, that war is still going on.
Uwe, so I like the clear and hold. And that makes sense. But obviously there were complications. You can't know for sure who's VC. Who can I trust? Right? I mean, that's obviously part of the frightening PTSD kind of
concern. That's when you know that, because if you have good spooks, you know what's going on.
Okay.
Go to chapter 3, where this Captain Nguyen, a South Vietnamese captain, I was going. He said there are some villages he took me to. He said, 1/3 of the population are pro-VC. And I said, why don't you do anything about it? He said, why would I? I know who they are, each and every one of them.
Okay.
As long as I know, who cares?
So take it to France. You spend a lot of time in France. Yeah. You live for a lot of the year in France, at least up until recently. What's going on there? I mean, this is, to me, I say, well, what do I clear and hold? What's the breakdown of intelligence? What is the cultural difficulty of saying no to this, yes to this, establishing some kind of way of being within the French context?
And we're talking in the context of the Charlie Hebdo and...
It's really, I mean, we before Charlie Hebdo thing, you'd talked about some of the concerns you'd had watching things transpire in France. What's the situation there? What are your fears? What are the possibilities?
Well, the possibilities are actually, I think the French have woken up.
Yeah, seems so.
And heavy duty. And I mean, even this wimpish President Hollande are now sending an aircraft carrier to fight ISIS. That's quite something. He has, first of all, in France, you always have to say one thing in France: their intelligence services are pretty bloody good.
Okay.
Internal and external. I mean, I got some my information from them in Vietnam, for example, and I know so much so that when I had one problem with French customs, I suddenly found myself confronted by a file that thick, and every story I've ever written was included in there, and the evaluation by the French spooks. Fortunately, it said in my favor, "Il est un bon." He's good. He's a good guy. So I mean, it helps. But that is one thing. The other thing is that in France, again, we're talking about things being underreported on this side of the Atlantic. In France, Christianity is staging a comeback. And that's been going on for quite some time. I'm not saying numerically, but in quality, it is amazing. And you go into a good French Catholic church, you hear solid sermons. You think you're in faith couple here.
And just the scholarship and the richness of the tradition. I mean, many of the folks that I really admired out in the UK when I was studying there were looking to some of these new, 1950s on Catholic writers from France.
Oh, yeah.
So that's true, at least as an intellectual tradition.
There is a big tradition there. I mean, I would, again, here's the cliche thinking on this side of the Atlantic, that all of Europe is lost. Germany is not lost either. In Germany, you have what people don't know. You can't get this published in the secular media. Here is that, for example, the Independent Lutheran Church of Germany and some Baptist churches and some Catholic archbishops are baptizing Muslims left, right, and center. I mean, you can use this whole threat of Islam or Muslims pouring into Europe, the other way around. You can say it can be also become an entrapment, but that depends on the quality of the conviction of Christians in France, which I think they're small in numbers, maybe just 1/3, but they are solid, or in Germany, or in Britain for that matter.
But Uwe, how do you fight a group of people that are not deterred by death? You know, I mean, this is a unique kind of situation. I mean, this is an ideology that's leading to some kind of, conflagration and bring it on. This is the end of the world. This is great.
Yeah, you see, now we're into the theme of Shirleyism, which, of course,
that is pertaining to the so-called end of the 1,000-year reign, or the end of the earth.
And giving God a helping hand in immanentizing the eschaton, or bringing pulling paradise on earth into our present reality.
Sure, we did this. Progressives did this in the 19th century in America. We're going to bring the kingdom.
We did
to
this.
us.
This was what the conflict between Luther and Thomas Müntzer was all about in
16th century,
the peasant wars and that sort of thing. And from Münzer, let's just go through this thing, and then we get to your question.
Oh yeah, no, it's important.
From Münzer, there is a direct line to Marxism-Leninism.
Yeah.
And to National Socialism.
Engels picks him up.
Engels picks up Münzer.
Münzer calls himself the hammer and sickle of God.
Yeah.
Where do you see that? Hammer and sickle again?
That's right. And both Friedrich Engels and Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologue of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, defer to Münzer, okay? And the whole fight between Münzer and Luther was that Luther said, no, we have to serve in the left-hand kingdom here, and we cannot presume God. It is, by the way, it's biblical, of course. It is God who will ultimately decide when Christ comes back and when. Okay.
So the point with Luther was, do your job, be a good citizen, fulfill your vocation, and don't try pulling God down.
And Dan, isn't it funny that in doing this, when people think back, what are the black marks on Luther's legacy? Yeah. It's statements about the Jews, and it's statements to the nobility related to the Peasants' War. And I think, leaving aside the question about his statements related to the Jews, look at this one bit of business on the Peasants' War. He actually kind of gets vindicated on this, not because I'm a Lutheran, but he's saying, hey, treat the peasants with respect, but don't try to institute a utopia. This always goes wrong. It's always ugly. It's always worse than the thing you were starting with.
Yes, and you know, when Luther turned against Münzer was, of course, when the peasants wanted to storm the castles of the princes and the knights and all that sort of thing. Now, here's a phenomenon which is very compelling, I think. We have this in Christianity, actually less so than elsewhere, but we have it in Christianity.
We have this sort of eschatology.
Well, no, the Shirleyism, you know, the utopian
apocalyptic. It comes up from time to time.
Okay, it comes up, but it's basically rather minute. Right now, you have tiny evangelical groups who.
But the Orthodox and the Catholics say, no, that's silly. Let's marginalize that.
Right. No, and you have tiny evangelical groups who say we have to give God a helping hand in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem.
That's a whole nother.
Okay. Now you see. Now here's the other thing. You have the Muslims. Al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISS, is committed to creating the new caliphate and to actually take Europe. I mean, it's the third attempt after Charles Martel kicked them out, and after they failed to take Vienna. Now there's the next one. So you have that, and unknown to most people, you have the same phenomenon in Hinduism.
Yeah, this has been coming up in the news this week.
Yeah, in Hinduism, where the Hindu Trinity consists of the Creator, the Sustainer, and Shiva, the Destroyer. Okay, the radical Hindus who are actually right now in power in Delhi claim that they are called by Shiva, the destroyer within the Hindu trinity, to give Shiva a helping hand in destroying the universe so as to enable Brahma, the creator, to recreate a new universe. Because, of course, unlike in Christianity, in Eastern religions, you have the cyclical developments. Okay.
They want to push the reset button on the video game.
Craziest thing, I mean, was totally ignored by the media here, when in the 80s you had this Om Shinrikyo sect, which is the Buddhist sect. Mm-hmm. Well, when you had that sect, I interviewed actually their leaders.
Wow!
And with the help of a very beautiful, very elegant,
retired
Japanese.
Was she a opium runner?
No, she was not. No,
was this before or after the subway?
No, this was after the subway thing. After they had detonated these chemical devices in the subway trains, and the Shoko Asahara, their leader, is of course sitting on death row somewhere in a Japanese jail. But I went to one of their monasteries and interviewed the acting leader. And I had this Japanese girl who spoke perfect German, imperial court German. It's unbelievable. It broke me to tears. And the next thing, I had her under my armpits, shivering and shaking because she was so scared of this son of a bitch, who said that the reason why they had done this is to provoke a nuclear war between the United States and Japan. Logic is not
likely wouldn't have happened. Yes.
And I said, "Now, and what is all this about?" He said, "Well, you see." I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, you say you're a Christian. Here's the Bible. We are actually the servants of Christ." And I said, "Whoa, I thought you were Hindus or you're a Buddhist and you believed in Shiva." And yeah, but who's Christ for you? Christ is the incarnation of Shiva. And Shiva has called us to fight the forces of the world, the kings of the world, it says in Scripture, princes of the world, in order to help Shiva destroy the universe so that Brahma can start a new thing. These things, because
Uwe, I want to shiver underneath your armpit because this is. I mean, you've just brought us to a place where I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. Right, I mean, like in a sense that, if you've got...
It's not our light, at least, no. There might be,
getting a little bit...
So so here we have a number of things repeating themselves, right? From what you've put forth in your book, The Triumph of the Absurd, to what's happening with ISIS and your article on just the horrific things that are happening to the people in the Middle East. You take this and you can take the same sort of apocalyptic ideals and you look at it in other religions. You look at it in Christianity too, right? There are elements in Christianity.
Yeah, but it's minute.
It is.
And it is not... Now, wait a minute. Let me just cut you in there because you mentioned Christianity. It's not in Scripture, but it is in Islam.
Yes, in Islam,
in the
idea of the final imam coming.
So we have a mechanism for saying no. Turn to the ethic of Jesus, and let's not do it this way. At least there's a mechanism for it. And plus, we got 66 books, multiple authors. There's a way of kind of wrestling with these things.
Let me tell you something, because to answer your question, what can we do? Of course, what can we do? Ultimately, it's God's ways, but. There is a phenomenon underway that we know in Germany, but also in this country and elsewhere, that Muslims, more and more Muslims, want to convert. They are seeking the right God. The Independent Lutheran Church in Germany is baptizing Muslims left, right, and center. There are two parishes in Berlin and one in Leipzig in particular. They're baptizing. There's a Roman Catholic Archbishop told a friend of mine that he personally baptizes 50 Muslims, an average of 50 Muslims per month. I believe the only thing we as Christians can do is to confront them with truth. And I know this from discussions. I used to be religious affairs editor of United Press International, and I had an enormous amount of data, even back in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, showing that there is a tendency of Muslims seeking the true God. And they are being rejected very often by politically correct state-related churches in Germany, for example, especially Protestants. I think the only thing we can do is, first of all, yes, defend ourselves properly and not pull tail as Obama did in the case of Iraq and as the Americans did in the case of Vietnam. Not the American soldiers, but the American politicians and the media have a decent defense policy for us. But basically, as Christians and as thinkers and as writers, confront the Muslims very pleasantly with our God. There's a difference between the God who demands of his followers 109 times in the Quran to spread the faith by violent means and kill converts, and between a God who says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and who says, most importantly, judge not lest you be judged. And if there's one amongst you without sin, let him cast the first stone. It is a totally different God. And that different God, if he is properly proclaimed and lovingly proclaimed to Muslims, you will find that Islam will collapse. Which is, by the way, the assessment of sociologists of religion in Germany and in France, that to all intents and purposes, Islam is collapsing.
And the only way it's happening is through a paradigm shift, whereby it's not them being held down in a sort of or a search and destroy
or manipulative.
Manipulative.
It's like here's a different way.
Here's a way to think about the world wherein you do not have to kill, wherein you do not have to support things that if others are doing their job, if the politicians, if the journalists are doing their job, if we're actually seeing the horrors and seeing what's happening, and we're talking right now in particular about what's happening with ISIS, what's happening in the Middle East, if we're looking at the horrors, and if we make everyone look at the horrors, and we don't just move to the next thing because, well, the next story is going to be attractive as well, but we stick with these horrors, and we say, keep looking at it, and then offer alternative paradigms whereby this doesn't have to be the case. That's how it's going to change, not necessarily via nastiness or...
No, certainly not nastiness. And, I mean, look, I can give you an example. Okay, a number of examples, actually. As well, but one is particular. There is a deaconess, a Lutheran deaconess in Berlin, who runs a small parish, state-related church parish, but she's separate from the others simply because she's actually a believer, you know. But they were robes, the deaconesses in Germany. She walks around these 90% Muslim neighborhoods in Berlin. There's huge sections of Berlin, 300,000, 400,000 people, all Muslims, you know. She walks around totally unmolested. And when she talks, they come around and they talk to her. They take her seriously. And she would not say, no, it's the same God. Your God is our God. No, my God says judge not lest you be judged. My God makes himself small for you, for me. My God is not one who sits aloofly somewhere and you'll never see. My God, you can see in a little stable, and you can see him on the cross. That's where you see him, and that has effect. She told me that. She said, she is totally fearless. She goes about, and she is converting one little woman, a deaconess. She started out with a congregation of 15. She now has 150 2 years later.
She's attracting them to a different way. And if you
God,
you go back to faithfulmasks.org, you can find a number of things, especially in the back catalog from Dr. Uwe Siemon-Netto on some of these same themes that we reposted. Also, I did a piece on the idea that Jesus is the answer to the problems in the Middle East before this stuff went down, and it was kind of tongue in cheek. Yeah. But the idea is that even if I'm not even saying you have to convert to my form of Christianity or whatever, but it is that paradigm shift of saying instead of an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, love your enemies.
That's right.
Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who are out to destroy you. It's an incredibly different paradigm.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing, and the parallels that we could go on and keep talking about, but as we wrap up here, the parallels between the absurdity which you have and you saw firsthand in Vietnam. Right. We're seeing the same absurdities happen, and whether we can talk about the politics, we can talk about the president, we can talk about the problem with journalism and the problem with the news, and those are all things that we should talk about. But the most important thing is to see that what's going to happen in the Middle East, what's going to happen with ISIS, is only going to change if we confront it and we see it, and we offer a different paradigm.
And have some perseverance to not just give up and just get tired of a very important concern.
It takes years and years and years. It might take centuries, But I find it absolutely absurd to believe that everything is lost. No, it's not lost. I don't think Europe is lost. Look, I'm talking to Germany and to France every day on the phone, and to rather competent and prominent people.
And for how many centuries have we had those prophets telling us all is lost?
Oh, yeah.
For how many centuries have we heard, well, this is the end? Yeah. How many centuries have we heard they're at the gate and it's all over? Yeah. And especially where we want things fast and quick. Yeah. Maybe we just need to be patient, be kind, be thoughtful, and approach this.
Friends, we got a show that we like to decant.
Yes.
We like to have a long form conversation. We like to now have conversations about the long view, and that's really hard to hear. That this might not be a solvable situation in 6 months or 2 years.
Yeah, there might not be a short.
But that virtue of courage and perseverance and all this, this is something you've been doing in your life and your work. We thank you for starting the League of Faithful Masks. Thank you.
Started
it's great.
The podcast.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for continuing and allowing me to lose some lime in my walk through the park. You see.
Well, absolutely, Uwe. Thank you so much for being here. Once again, Triumph of the Absurd, A Reporter's Love for the Abandoned People of Vietnam. In its third edition, you can go to 1517legacy.com, and that's where you can pick up a copy of this book. It's got a picture of a very dashing Uwe on the cover with a cigarette and his press credentials. The parallels between this and ISIS is something we've talked about before. You can go back into our back catalog, and we've got interviews with you where you tell even more stories about the Courier.
Good stuff, the best stories.
Yep. But read that in the book.
virtueinthewasteland.com,
and
the show page.
And that's where it's at. So, Uwe, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Right. Safe travels. Safe travels.
All right. Well, we'll get together again when I get back.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.
All right, that's the show.